There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some more. All right, Stephen and I brought in two individuals for this podcast today. One we've already had on. So you guys, if you go way back, I think it's been over a year since Matt's been with us, but he is a rangeland scientist. He's the owner of Shining Horizons Land Management, a research associate with the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative, and an advisor for Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. He's Matt Barnes. Matt, awesome to have you back with us today.
Thanks. Great to see you guys again.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, it's been a while, but good to see you. And a newcomer here for us. She is a senior policy professional for conservation and animal welfare for 35 years. She's the campaign director of Oceanic Preservation Society and also an advisor for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. She's Courtney Vail. Courtney, it's wonderful to have you here. Thanks for joining us on this one.
Thank you. So good to be here with you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is vitally important because we are, those of you that listen to the podcast on the regular, our last episode we spoke with Cassie Kamara, who discussed the media, the influences, and the things that really happened with Prop 114 and the vote itself. Obviously, those of you that have been paying attention in Colorado and with the Wolf News, that Prop 114 did pass in 2020, and now Colorado Parks and Wildlife have just released their first draft of the wolf reintroduction plan December 9th, so roughly about a month ago. So Matt and Courtney are going to be here to really dive into the details, give us really the insight of what the draft is looking like, and then I guess how this is sort of going to move forward. So again, thanks for both of you for getting here. Courtney, I just want to get background for you because we've had Matt on before. Just give everyone a little insight about really how you've been doing this work for over 3 decades and what got you into really being a conservation animal welfare individual coming from a science and psychology background.
Well, it started early. It began as a little girl. I was 4 or 5 years old and saw the harp seals being clubbed on the ice floes of Canada on television in the early 70s. And my path was pretty much set at that moment, literally. So with those images seared in my mind, you could say I was attuned to our brutality against nature very early in my development. So I was firm of purpose and self-directed from that early age. I started my own Ranger Rick Club in grade school. I'm not sure if that dates me, but I think it's still around, Ranger Rick. And I loved every creature that slithered, crawled, prowled, swam, and I still do. And I was completely focused on advocacy for animal welfare and wildlife, including through college and my graduate work in psychology and law.
That's great. And then just go a little bit into your position at Oceanic Preservation Society and what that entails as a campaign director. So you're building the campaigns and sending these out to the individuals that follow Oceanic Preservation Society. What's the role there for you?
Well, I have to be pretty much an expert on a lot of issues facing the planet today. So what I love about campaign work and being a campaign strategist and policy strategist is that you need to be somewhat of a hybrid animal. You have to be able to call upon the science while making compelling legal, ethical, or even political arguments. So you have to use every tool in the toolbox to try to move the needle in favor of protecting nature and wildlife. So that's essentially what I do as a campaign director for Oceanic Preservation Society, working on most of the issues you can imagine, from deforestation to illegal wildlife trade to whale and dolphin hunting to climate change. So it runs the gamut of focusing on the most critical and pressing issues facing the planet today.
Do you feel that your schooling background, because you have a bachelor's in wildlife biology and then a master's in psychology, do you feel, because you spoke about the tools in the toolbox, are those some of the things that you reference over the 30 plus years that you've been working and developing these policies and things of that sort?
Yes. I mean, I've always been drawn to the social sciences because they complement the biological or ecological sciences, where the human dimensions of wildlife give us the space and the insight to better understand human nature and decision making, and most importantly, our attitudes and belief systems. and our relationships to each other and the natural world. So, and how that informs policy. Science only gets us so far. Wildlife science can tell us what we might do, but it doesn't tell us what we should do. So science is really just part of the picture and should be considered in partnership with values and ethics. And it's, I guess, the limitations of the physical sciences that we can complement with social sciences, where sometimes it's taboo for researchers to consider values and ethics for fear that normative judgments might color or threaten neutrality of the scientific studies. And this is where I find the most challenging work and the most relevancy for the other elements of policymaking, which necessarily involve the human element and human dimension.
Matt, just to touch on that human element. So you're both part of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. What is it like working with Courtney, and how you guys are able to really use both of your expertises to push policies forward and be a part of something as special and really informative as this Colorado wolf reintroduction plan?
Well, working with Courtney is always exciting because, as you can tell, she's kind of a firebrand, and that keeps things interesting. She doesn't let me just sit back and wear my scientist hat all the time and not engage in the politics, which would probably be my preference if I could get away with it. So, it's great, and because in some ways we see things very similarly. We both are trying to work in the messy middle and move things forward. And we both recognize that sometimes change is incremental. But then we also come at it from slightly different viewpoints that I think really complement each other.
So in speaking of, and we're just going to dive right in because there's a lot to talk about. And again, I'm going to say this a couple times throughout, and I'm sure Matt and Courtney will say too, this plan that was released by Colorado Parks and Wildlife is strictly a draft. So this is really the first go at it. So we're just touching on the stuff that's out there right now. And we'll see, we're just going to give the information to everyone out there so that they can make the informed decision.
Actually, speaking of that, can we just start there in the context of this plan? What does draft mean? What are they waiting for to finalize?
Yeah. So the way this works is CPW convened a stakeholder group and a technical group to advise them on how to do this plan. And this is the first draft that they've produced that's largely based on the input of those two groups. And the public has until January 22nd to make comments on it. And the staff basically anticipates a lot of public comment and also requested changes from the Parks and Wildlife Commission that oversees the agency. And hopefully they will incorporate that into a revised version of this plan, which they expect to finalize by April and have essentially not quite signed into law, but adopted by the commission in May of 2023.
So I'm interested in how this public commenting works. So the public sends in their concerns, and then what amount of the same comment needs to be presented for it to warrant a change, or how does public comment inevitably affect the plan? Am I making sense?
Well, that's yet to be seen. That's yet to be seen. You have to understand that the stakeholder process has been happening for about a year, over a year. Convening the SAG and the TWIG, we'll use the acronyms from here on in, the stakeholder advisory groups. And all along the way, public comment has been received by the commission and by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So there have been virtual opportunities for the general public to testify and give their comments. And so those two have been incorporated into that stakeholder process. The plan itself, now that it's released, must give time for public comment and opportunity for stakeholders to respond. And hopefully we can improve those aspects of the plan that are not satisfactory to us.
Got it.
Because I've seen, and I'm sure, I don't know if you guys saw this too, once they released the plan, and Stephen and I we were checking Instagram and things like that, and it was an immediate flood of comments that they were firing back at Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they seem to handle it pretty well. just because you could tell it was somewhat of a contentious issue. It was basically 50-50 down the middle. It was contentious for some, and people were praising them for the way that they've approached this so far. Courtney, from your perspective, and then we'll go to Matt, how do you feel that they've been handling that just in a PR standpoint? Because again, social media can get very virulent very quickly, and they really seem to have their answers in a row and just sort of getting by those first, couple of days or even that first week of when it's first released.
So when you do things by consensus, you have to be willing to make concessions. And there were many groups and individuals that on the front end of this plan that didn't believe in the stakeholder process to begin with, that it would be biased or stilted in favor of certain perspectives. And, that all of that, it needs to be taken into account when looking at the balancing act that CPW must do in trying to develop a plan that serves all and to align common values and come up with a plan for reintroduction. So Rocky Mountain Wolf Project was supportive of the stakeholder process, and we respect it. And because it is a process, the entire journey of receiving public input, which prompts dialogue and discussion between stakeholders, that's also part of the process that can forge collaboration, soften attitudes, and inspire change all along the way and into the future, forcing us to get out of our separate corners. So understanding that and understanding that there are pressures from various corners on CPW and the Commission, I think they've done a good job as a good starting point. Could the plan be better? Yes. Is it a good plan? Yes. So again, as Matt said, sometimes progress is incremental and not all at once. And this plan, I think, represents steps in the right direction to achieve the aims of Proposition 114 and the aims of the implementing statute, which codifies Proposition 114.
Matt, for you, how did you feel the stakeholder advisory group, the TWIG and the SAG? I can only use the acronyms, like Courtney said, just to shorten it. Well, how did you feel that process went? And obviously, having both of you a part of this, what was that like for you? And how do you feel that went? Because as Courtney said, there were some groups and I guess individuals that were opposed to this form of how they went about drafting the plan.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was honored to be on the stakeholder advisory group, the SAG. It's one of the most fascinating experiences of my career, actually, over the last year and a half or so. So this group was 17 voting members plus 3 ex officio members, the 3 being essentially agency representatives. And then the other 17, more or less representing certain constituency groups. So several wolf advocates, several ranchers, several hunters or outfitters. Actually, probably the majority of the group were hunters or outfitters in some way or another, because several of the wolf advocates are also hunters, including myself. But it was never really intended to represent all Coloradans, which would be impossible in a group of less than 20 people. And so that's been a point of contention among a bunch of the pro-wolf folks who were not SAG members over the last year and a half. And for which is understandable. And that's one of the reasons why this group, because it really has sort of 3 core groups within it. And some of us overlap and have a foot in all 3 of those subgroups, if you will. And so the thing about the SAG is it was organized to be a consensus group. So if there are things that wolf advocates and hunters and ranchers can all agree on, they're probably good policy. And that, at least that's the basic idea. But ultimately, it's going to be a compromise. So groups like this only make progress through some kind of compromise. And I think to folks who just saw Prop 114 pass, they didn't see any reason why they should have to compromise on anything. So, that is understandable. So, and there's another concern too, and it's for the reasons I just mentioned, that stakeholder groups in general tend to empower traditional constituencies. And there's some truth to that, but it all comes down to is it facilitated in a way that those traditional constituencies can find areas of agreement and turn those into productive policy? If so, then it's a good thing. And I think we really tried to do that. We actually did find things where wolf advocates, hunters, and ranchers could actually agree on some things. There are a whole lot of things we couldn't agree on. So it's really interesting. And I guess that's just how democracy works sometimes.
And I would just add that, sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. And there are many positive aspects and positive statements in that plan that we needed to see and we should expect to see in the final plan, and that are buried in this dense plan of nearly 300 pages with attachments. The plan itself is about 67 pages. But, some people will see what they want to see in this plan and see only that and what serves them best. But I hope that we can welcome the positive. For instance, one of the basic tenets and core philosophies of that plan that was kind of a foundation of the stakeholder process is that the minimization of lethal take and building trust among communities. And I know that building trust is a good outcome of the stakeholder process, and it's one that I hope that we can expect to see continue. And Rocky Mountain Wolf Project is going to hold on to that statement in the plan, believe in it, and hold CPW accountable to this as we move forward.
Matt, can you just share with everyone more specifics of the process by which someone ends up a member of this SAG?
Oh, yeah, excellent question and an important one. So CPW actually put out a request for people to apply to it, and anyone could apply. I think probably the only actual requirement was that they did have to be a Colorado resident. And whereas the technical group's different, most of the technical group members are actually not Coloradans because they come from places that have wolves and therefore they have expertise. But the stakeholder group was meant to represent Coloradans. So, and I think that they wanted a group of people that was in some sense balanced, although balance is a really tricky word and sometimes I think it's a trap. But the other thing they really looked for is people who would be willing to try to see issues from multiple perspectives and try to find solutions and be willing to, at least on some level, to change their views or find compromise to eventually move forward with something that would be agreeable, not just to themselves, but to the other stakeholders. And I think that was the key, more than, say, experience with wolves, which only a few stakeholders actually could claim to have.
And I just want to repeat something I said earlier, that the stakeholder process forces you to see, quote unquote, who you might consider the enemy, another stakeholder group, see them as human beings, see them as potential partners for collaborative solutions, to kind of dismantle the stereotypes and to force an interaction that is maybe normally polarized. And all of that is part of that process. And I have to also emphasize that a basic agreement and another tenet of the process is that SAG recommendations are supposed to receive priority consideration by CPW and the commission. And where they don't in the plan is where we are focusing our attention. And that's explicit in the stakeholder process. So, it's not perfect, but again, it's done some good. And I think it's hopefully preempting perhaps some of the hostility and venom that may be awaiting us if we can't find solutions together.
Courtney, from your perspective, because this really seems to be in your wheelhouse about going to individuals or groups that oppose each other in terms of policy and drafting management or things that you've done over the course of your career. What has this been like for you to be able to see how this was handled once the vote was passed, and knowing that Colorado was trying to do this, at least on the front page, let's say, the right way? As because there have been comparisons to Yellowstone introduction, Idaho introduction, things of that sort, and other management plans. From where you were sitting and are still sitting, how do you think the process thus far, and you keep saying it's bringing different people to the table and doing things like that, but from your perspective so far, how has this process gone?
Well, again, having worked within the regulatory and governmental agency environment with Fish and Wildlife and EPA, as well as in the private and nonprofit sectors, I do have a balanced perspective regarding the difficulties of developing policies that serve all or serve many, but that also maintain the precautionary approach to err on the side of wildlife and the natural world. Because I do believe we need to tip the scales on the side of nature, not only because we are dependent on nature and a healthy planet, but because wildlife has been exploited since time immemorial and subjected to extreme abuses by humankind, and sometimes for our own pleasure or our own entertainment, right? So I obviously want to err on the side of wildlife and animal welfare. And when you have the culture of management agencies, wildlife management agencies, that needs to be challenged, and you have diverse interests, it's very easy to not only victimize but villainize the partners that are working together to ensure hopefully a humane and secure future for wolves in Colorado. I've worked on so many environmental and wildlife issues that involve human conflict, and they have enduring and protracted conflict. And having the background in working with marine mammals specifically, for instance, in trying to oppose certain traditions or customs that might be painful for a segment of society, we have to truly care about the other person on the other side of the table and their livelihood and their concerns. And so that we can learn to speak to each other and learn to find a bridge, because that's the way wildlife will be served at the end of the day. Making an enemy out of your opponent, if you want to call them that, or someone that shares a different belief, only entrenches those beliefs and sometimes leads to retaliation or a continuation of the very activity that we don't want to see, whether it's hunting wolves or persecuting wolves or any other wildlife out there. So I see the difficulty and the challenges from a regulatory agency perspective. And I also am able to sit on the side of the fence as an activist and an advocate and challenge those systems that should be challenged and that should advance into more progressive dimensions rather than establishing the status quo. And I think the Proposition 114 most definitely was a progressive initiative that seeks more from Colorado. It seeks more from Colorado than what's happening around the borders in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana with the eradication of wolves. So there's a lot there to unpack, but it's challenging. But I think CPW has positioned itself well in dealing with the criticism that they knew was coming.
There were 5 areas, and Matt, I pulled this from you, and I think these are the main things that we were going to get into here. And then actually, I want to start with Courtney, because you've mentioned this a couple of times. Then Matt, I want to get your take on this too, is the lethal control aspect. So you said, Courtney, right off the bat, so far in this draft, that this is a positive thing in that. And I looked at the lethal control, and it's really secondary to all non-lethal methods, first and foremost. And that seemed to be a positive that you brought up. What's some of the things that you have seen so far that have leaned you in that direction? And what are some of these non-lethal methods? Are they different than, say, flaggery, the big sound machines and things like that? Or is it really the typical non-lethal methods that they're trying to implement to stay away from lethal control in terms of helping wolves not be killed in that situation?
So there's a lot of questions there, but I think the main question is about the conflict minimization within the plan and provisions for that and emphasis on that. So the conflict minimization should be the heart and soul of this plan, and it currently is not, and actually might be the most disappointing part of the draft plan. So the statute codifying Proposition 114 mandates that CPW assist owners of livestock in preventing and resolving conflicts between wolves and livestock. And the word prevention is prominent and significant and deliberate. And so we would expect the plan to heavily reflect prevention, and it should be the core of wolf planning, restoration, and management. It should be the core to minimize livestock conflict. And that mirrors the language in CPW's current wolf plan that was developed in 2004, which has been in place for 17 years. And I think most Coloradans would expect their state wildlife agency to both protect wild animals and work to minimize conflict with domestic ones. So ideally, we would like to see the use of strategies to prevent or reduce wolf livestock conflict. I don't think wolf advocates or livestock producers want to see conflict and depredations, and especially those measures should be required on public lands. So we believe, and I believe, that non-lethal coexistence measures are more cost-effective and ethical than lethal strategies. There are a lot of reasons for that, and we can talk about some of that and the biology behind that as well. So prevention is in there, but it's not as prominent as we would like it to be. And more so, prevention and coexistence measures are not required before compensation is paid out to producers for depredations. So it's notable, it's just notable that the compensation receives far more attention in the plan than conflict reduction, and that imbalance should be corrected.
Matt, what do you think about that?
I would agree with that 100%. There's a reason why conflict prevention is mentioned explicitly in Prop 114, which is now state law. It's mentioned before compensation, for example, and the state law actually doesn't say anything about lethal control. But it's clear that the intent is that the agency is expected to do what it can to prevent conflicts and to help landowners and livestock owners prevent conflicts. So the stakeholder group did come up with a few pages of recommendations that all 17 of those folks agreed to by consensus and submitted that to CPW. That section in the plan right now is really only about 1 page long. And I think it really needs to be built out into a much more robust conflict prevention plan. And for example, there's a lot of attention to how to pay compensation to livestock owners, and there needs to be at least that much attention paid to how to prevent those conflicts in the first place. And that is really important, not just because it was the intent of Prop 114, but if you look at the 5 states of the Northern Rockies and compare conflict rates between Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Washington, and Oregon, there is far more conflict in Wyoming than anywhere else, and far less conflict in Washington and Oregon than in any of the other states. And that's even after you adjust it for the number of wolves in those states, because there's only about 200 wolves each in Washington and Oregon, 300 and some in Wyoming, and then over 1,000 each in Montana and Wyoming, or excuse me, Montana and Idaho. And the most likely explanation for that is that Washington and Oregon spend a lot of money preventing conflicts. In fact, Washington spends about as much money on preventing conflicts as Wyoming does on compensation. And in Wyoming, it's the complete reverse. They spend about 10 times as much on compensation as they do on preventing conflicts in the first place. And they have a lot more conflicts. So it's pretty clear if you just treat each of those 5 states as its own data point, the ones that invest in preventing conflict or that require conflict prevention prior to engaging in lethal control, for example, they have a lot less conflict because they've set up incentives to figure out how to prevent it from happening in the first place. And the reason that works, underlying all of this, is that only about 1 out of every 5 wolf packs is known to kill livestock. And most of those cases, it's a one-off or something like that. But every once in a while, some wolf packs learn that it's pretty easy to do, and that if you do enough of it, it gets easier and easier. And we don't want that to happen. We got to stop that. But yeah, in fact, the last year that the federal government compiled data across all of those states, they found that 17% of wolf packs were known to kill 1 or more livestock in a year. And to me, that's really important, because that means, okay, we need to figure out how to keep that number low, and we need to figure out what tools and techniques help keep that number low, and then how do we promote those and make them more easily adopted by livestock owners and managers. So yeah, I guess that's my I thought it was going to be my short answer. It turned into a long one.
Well, if I can add to that too, there's really no excuse not to elaborate on the conflict minimization to underpin this entire plan, because the draft plan does, the one positive aspect of the plan, it does speak to public and private organizations providing support for conflict minimization in consultation with CPW, pretty much addressing any concerns over resourcing and adequacy of staffing and things like that by collaborating with stakeholders outside of CPW to support conflict prevention. And it's something that Rocky Mountain Wolf Project is doing and has been doing, and we can share more about that if we get there. So it's going to require, prevention is going to require all stakeholders, not just producers. And from our perspective, producers do have an obligation. Predation is nothing new, and predation is important to healthy ecosystems. And it's pretty much the cost of raising prey animals on working landscapes. So from our perspective, we believe that producers do have an obligation to actively participate in preventing wolf depredations and coexistence.
Well, so hypothetically, what's going to have to happen, Courtney, or what might happen? Just give us a scenario that might happen that would move CPW to add more language into this plan before its finalization, referring to prevention to some kind of satisfactory level.
Hopefully the preponderance and the overwhelming pressure and feedback that we as the general public and pointing out where the draft plan misaligns or doesn't align with SAG recommendations. So, I mean, we are somewhat at the mercy at the end of the day of what the commission, not just CPW, but the commission decides. They're responsible for endorsing and basically finalizing that management plan. I just wanted to add that a little bit more about lethal removal and lethal control if we're moving off that topic, because early in the draft plan, CPW acknowledges the value of lethal removal while also indicating that they want to minimize it. But they look at the value of lethal removal for increasing social tolerance. And this is not fact, right? And actually, this claim is highly controversial and not really supported by the scientific literature. Blood does not buy goodwill. And the plan later contradicts itself when it states that it's unclear whether lethal removal in situations of livestock depredations improves human tolerance for wolves. There's scientific studies that show that lethal control may actually increase illegal take or poaching of wolves. So the success of lethal control is highly specific, highly local, short-term, and I think the jury's out on lethal control as an effective tool to address depredations. And in fact, the draft plan even states that. So it's not something that should be primarily relied upon for certain. And the coexistence and prevention and non-lethal minimization techniques and the plan needs to be elaborated upon in the draft plan for the final.
Yeah. So maybe this is more specifically what I was asking, what you just mentioned before that last thought is we're kind of at the whims of public comment and hoping that it's taken seriously and implemented in the plan. So yeah. So a public comments are made, and then what exactly happens? What's the process by which it's considered?
So there's 4 or 5 opportunities for the public to input before February. And of course, we need to talk about the fact that if this draft plan is not satisfactory to some groups, there will be lawsuits, I'm certain, in areas where these groups or individuals feel that it departs from Proposition 114 or the statute, or from SAG and TWIG recommendations. So that's ultimately a lever that could be deployed. But as far as CPW and the Commission's incorporation of the comments, as with any regulatory agency, we may be happy, we may be unhappy at the end of the day.
This I'm trying to get at is like when the public makes a comment, who exactly is considering
the commission.
them? Okay.
So the commission is ultimately the arbiter of the plan. Matt, would you agree with that?
Yes. I mean, that's technically right. I think all the comments that they get are going to probably be filtered through the CPW staff who are actually writing the plan. But ultimately, the plan belongs to the commission. So, and legally, it's the commission's plan. So,
okay,
yeah.
And you were right, Courtney. So there's 5 opportunities. There's hearings with public comment between January 19th and February 22nd. We'll have that in the description for you guys. To those that live in Colorado, I think there actually is a virtual one that's happening in mid-February. So, but we'll give you guys that information. And I did remember my thought before we move off into the next thing. Is there anything that was floated, suggested in looking at, and please correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, Matt or Courtney, with money that gets moved to lethal control, isn't that taxpayer funded in part of taxpayer money, as opposed to, like, isn't that money being used, to lethally control these predators? Like, is there a way that that's looked at where they can say, hey, your tax dollars are being used not to prevent or to prevent these things, it's used to kill the wildlife that you go out and see? Has that been brought up? Is that something that's been floated, or is that too in the weeds to be put into action there?
Yeah. So the money that goes to do all this is the money that is in Colorado Parks and Wildlife's budget. And most of that money traditionally comes from hunting and fishing revenues, but this is different. The other major legal change that happened in Colorado in the last 2 years is that hunting and fishing revenues got walled off from wolf restoration and management. So yes, the taxpayers of Colorado are paying for wolf management, whether that means conflict prevention or compensation or lethal control or just the day-to-day monitoring. It's being paid for by the public, the people of Colorado. And I think that's important. It's a change from how agencies have long operated, and it essentially puts the entire public in the driver's seat instead of just the hunting and fishing public. And that that's happening in a lot of different ways here. But for a long, long time, hunting and fishing has driven all of wildlife management politics. In Colorado, only about 5% of adult Coloradans hold big game hunting licenses in any given year. Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, that number is probably about 4 times as much. But still, most of those people who aren't hunters support the right of other people to be hunters. But they're mostly picturing hunting deer and elk, not hunting wolves and bears.
Well, that's long been an issue, for instance, with APHIS and Wildlife Services, where Department of Agriculture is responsible for, dealing with wildlife conflict and injurious wildlife, as they would call it, and has given extreme liberal license to kill and eradicate wildlife across the United States. And that's taxpayers' money as well. So what the problem is that this system doesn't recognize other values. It needs to recognize the perspectives of not just producers and hunters, but there are other voices. And the ecological and economic benefits of wolves may be less obvious, but they far exceed the cost of wolves. And the absence of wolves, for someone like me and us, also presents its own conflict, that there are those of us who believe we should be compensated for a landscape without wolves. So photographers and nature enthusiasts, urban dwellers, we all have rights to the presence of wolves as inherent as the intrinsic value of wolves themselves. And furthermore, wolves serve as a keystone role in a biodiverse landscape that provides us with clean water and clean air. And so putting a dollar figure and a dollar amount on psychological well-being, it's nowhere in the plan. It's not even considered, right? I mean, it gives a passing paragraph to the value of wolf watching and ecotourism that might attend wolf restoration in Colorado. And, if we look at the non-consumptive use of wildlife as an important value to Coloradans and visitors alike, it's really missing from the plan. So livestock are raised on public and private lands in Colorado, which means wolves and livestock are going to overlap. But ranchers are not powerless bystanders. They have the responsibility to protect livestock from predation and for stewardship of all native wildlife, which they share the landscape with. So the plan needs to step it up a bit in that regard and amplify the positive impacts of wolves, the positive ecological benefits of wolves, and the other values of other stakeholders that are missing in the draft plan.
So to follow up on what you guys are saying, we've all recognized that this is an unprecedented way of putting the public in the driver's seat when it comes to decisions like this. But does it feel like an honest signal or an honest sign of a true paradigm shift from having hunters and anglers in the driver's seat to the public, or does this feel like a one-off thing?
I hope it's a paradigm shift. I think we would need to see the full spectrum of values and stakeholders in the commission, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, because that is meant to reflect the values of all Coloradans and all stakeholder groups. So the influence of that commission has been, I would say, stilted in the past to reflect consumptive use of wildlife. I think it's more balanced now, which is a very positive thing. So I think this ballot initiative has pushed the envelope in good ways, in positive ways.
And how does it feel to you, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's a sign of the changing times. And I guess one of the lenses I see this whole thing through is having been trained as a wildlife biologist. And so we've now spent over a century restoring native wildlife in North America, particularly out here in the West, where our entire profession of wildlife management, and you can say the same of range and forestry, it's all been formed in the hangover of the frontier era, and so in the whole way that you look at these issues probably is closely related to how you view the history of westward expansion and colonization in North America. I mean, if you tend to think of it as like this heroic frontier era, you probably think of, granddaddy was right to shoot the last wolf, that kind of a thing. But if you realize, actually this era we have so ridiculously romanticized was actually the destruction of the beauty and the nature of the West. You see it completely differently. And of course, the other whole half of that is not only was it the destruction, it was the theft from the native people who were already here, whose history was essentially erased as though they hadn't been here. But that's a subject for a whole nother podcast, probably with somebody who can speak more wisely than I can. But anyway, the point is, North American wildlife management, what we call the North American model of wildlife management, evolved in that context. And it was, we had to reintroduce elk to Colorado. There would be no elk in Colorado today. There would be no discussion of wolf restoration if we had not already had other reintroductions before this. The thing is, progress stalled out with the game animals like the deer, the elk, the wild turkeys. And that model was really successful for those because they had clear utilitarian value to human beings. The animals that are kind of more like competitors with us for the prey, the bears, the lions, and the wolves, obviously, we've had a little bit of a struggle getting them back because not everyone agrees that we need to. But and the North American model worked really well for those other species. We wouldn't be talking about wolf restoration right now if we didn't have the North American model. But it's time to move beyond that. And Prop 114 is one way that we are moving this profession beyond that. But it's not the only way. The entire Endangered Species Act actually goes beyond the North American model if you look at it closely. The North American model is really all about hunting, and the principles in it are good as long as you view them as just about hunting and not about all of wildlife. So, so there's a bunch of ways this is changing slowly, but the big thing is an underlying philosophical shift from seeing animals as resources to be harvested, hopefully sustainably, to seeing animals as fellow beings with consciousness that we can harvest if it makes sense to do so, because after all, we're animals too, and we happen to be predators too. But we also recognize that all animals have consciousness, all animals have value, and not only the value that they have to us in the utilitarian sense.
Yeah, that's very Yeah, that's well put by both of you. And I want to go back to what you guys were talking about, just economically too. I think to brush aside, and not that Courtney, you were brushing aside, it was your comment of saying they were brushing it aside. If you just look at, I was just at the gym before this podcast, and there was a group in there. They're going to Yellowstone, and they said, "Oh, just watch out, the national parks are packed." If that doesn't tell people that individuals, not just from this country, but around the world, want to come to North America to see these wild places and these these places that are so rich with, megafauna and these beautiful mountainscapes and these forests and all the leaves like this. These is a place that people should enjoy, all the time. And it brings in massive amounts of money and massive amounts of, just understanding that when you get back to the place where the West was before westward expansion, it's an awe to see. I mean, when we went to Yellowstone 2 years ago, just to be able to see that, when you go through and you're like, oh, there's pronghorn, oh, there's bighorn sheep, oh, there's wolves, oh, there's bear. It's just, you don't see this stuff all the time anywhere else around the world. So for that to be sort of brushed aside, to think about not only the benefit of just seeing it in person, but also economically driving it. And a lot of these places, these small little towns, are driven by ecotourism.
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, we know that people like to see dollar signs, and that can help. That can sometimes be the most compelling argument, unfortunately. It's part of the holistic view of what wolves mean to all Coloradans and what it can mean to the landscape and to the wilderness that we're trying to hang on to. Weave this mosaic of the landscape in Colorado that need to be taken into account. So that you can see how this is challenging, but the economic value of wildlife watching and the non-consumptive users of wildlife, so to speak, the photographers and the naturalists and the hikers and all of that. We need to find a way to acknowledge that value in this plan and in wildlife management in general.
I want to hit on something that is in here that, and I get a little muddy in the water with this because I know sometimes, and I'm talking about the recovery criteria. And I know I'm making a left turn here, but it's something I want to hit before we get too far along. And it's always interesting about each state, especially, when you talk about Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, about what they feel the number of wolves or the number of packs of wolves that it should be in order to say that they are recovered, they're threatened, they're able to be delisted and things of that sort. And I'm looking at, and if Matt or Courtney, whoever wants to take this first, and then the other can chime in, just go over the recovery criteria and what it means. Are we looking at another state? Are we looking at Colorado saying that we hit the number at, say, 150 or let's say 300 wolves, and that's considered a successful recovery program, and therefore that's where they're going to be managed at? Or are those numbers manageable? Again, I understand this is a draft. I know this isn't set in stone, but where is the number trending that you both can see? I guess I'll start with Matt first, and then Courtney will go to you.
Okay, this is an excellent question. And a lot of the conflict that we see right now in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming seems to be about the number of wolves, at least on the surface. For example, if you saw the film The Trouble with Wolves, it's expressed as a debate about how many wolves there should be. I actually think that that's a gloss over a much deeper philosophical divide about whether there should be wolves at all. Yeah, it is important, and we need to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the Northern Rockies states in this particular issue. And I would say that the most important thing to keep in mind here is that recovery of an endangered species is really a continuum. There's no single magic number at which you can say, okay, now the job is definitely done. There are several different ways you can estimate at what point it's safe to delist a species from the endangered species list, but that's not really the same as recovery. And in Prop 114, Prop 114 very intentionally used the phrase self-sustaining population. That actually is a scientifically defined concept in conservation biology. And it means not just that there are enough wolves to prevent extinction. It means that there are enough wolves that they are resilient across their range. It means that they are genetically healthy and robust, that there's connectivity between subpopulations. It's much more complex than just a number. And so the current numbers in the draft are to downlist from endangered to threatened at the state level, not the federal level, when at about 50 wolves, and then delist them at 150 wolves for a couple of years or 200 wolves at any time. Those numbers are pretty low. Now, if there's 200 wolves in the state and people are not killing them, yeah, that's enough to prevent them from going extinct again. But if there's 200 wolves in the state and people are actively killing them, it's a different story. So it really depends on what happens after delisting, because we know that delisting isn't when the job is done, but that was the source of a lot of the conflict in the Northern Rockies states, is they thought that, well, once wolves are delisted, that's all there should ever be. And so, as it's been put very many times, the federal floor became the state ceiling. And that conflict has persisted forever and ever. So in Colorado, one of the big things we need to do is emphasize that recovery is really a continuum, and that delisting is not the same as total success. So in the long run, Prop 114 defined wolves as a non-game species, and existing state law states that non-game species will be managed to the optimum carrying capacity of the habitat. Now, of course, when we don't have any wolves yet in Colorado, or very few, we don't really know what the carrying capacity is. It's been modeled scientifically, and most of the estimates for how many wolves could live in Colorado fall between 750 on the low end to about 1,500 on the high end. And there's a lot of uncertainty because we all know that human tolerance is going to be the limiting factor. And that's the hardest thing to model. It's a lot easier to model, the physical habitat or the prey base, things like that. If it were only about the prey base, and Colorado has almost as many elk as Montana and Idaho combined. If that was all that mattered, there would be room for thousands of wolves in Colorado. But we know that's not how it really works. So it's difficult to model human tolerance, but we think at a minimum carrying capacity somewhere around at least 750 wolves and probably over 1,000. Maybe the best estimate was done by a bunch of scientists led by Carlos Carroll, probably more than 20 years ago now, and they came up with about maybe 1,300. But in the long run, only the wolves are going to tell us how many wolves can fit in Colorado. And that's going to be determined by the amount of conflict. And that's why conflict prevention is so important. So to me, conflict prevention, how we're going to coexist with wolves, that's closely related to things not only like lethal control, but to delisting criteria. I think it would be better if the number for removing them from the state endangered list were higher. But the more important thing is what comes after delisting. So if endangered and threatened are phase 1 and phase 2 respectively, and then phase 3 is no longer endangered or threatened, but still non-game. Our intent with Prop 114 is that phase 3 essentially lasts until carrying capacity is reached. And we don't exactly know what that is. But the main thing is that even after those numbers are reached, we don't expect to see a lot of wolves getting killed. And we would like to see that a little bit more clearly reflected in the plan.
I mean, Matt said a lot of great things that I agree with. So, Colorado holds over 12 million acres of suitable wolf habitat just on the western slope alone, and a massive prey base of elk, over 300,000 elk, more than any other state in the union. And and other smaller wildlife that can easily support the return of multiple wolf populations to the Southern Rockies. So I think the primary problem, without specifying numbers, except that they need to be upwards, they need to up the downlisting criteria, is that these numbers represented in the plan are based on minimum numbers, which means those minimum numbers will serve as guidelines to manage downwards. At least that is how the public sees it, and that's how these numbers are being used in surrounding states, in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, where they are, working really diligently to eradicate wolf populations in those states down to a minimum number and a recovery threshold of about 150 wolves. So that's my primary concern and our concern, that those minimum numbers, probably don't even represent social tolerance either, and are not completely based in science. Rather, they're based in a range of experiences, lessons learned from other reintroduction efforts, and understanding the Northern Rocky Mountain population was founded by more than 30 to 50 wolves, right? Nearly 100 wolves with connectivity to Canada, which helped to establish those populations. And for all intents and purposes, Colorado should be treated like an island, because you have Mexican wolves in the south that are restricted artificially. They can't roam north of I-40 in Arizona and New Mexico. And then the surrounding states, again, wolves are lucky if they're going to be able to make it into the state, and natural recruitment really is going to be difficult for Colorado based on the policies of the surrounding states. So those numbers, we need to see those numbers higher.
I have two questions about both of your last statements, but I'll start with Matt and then go to Courtney. Matt, you mentioned part of the definition of recovery having to do with sustainability throughout their range, in quotations, as it's determined over time. But is the range defined specifically in the draft if you were to circle it on a map?
That's a good question. The plan doesn't say where wolves will and won't be. It does say that wolves will be allowed to exist anywhere that they find habitat and don't cause problems. And that's the concept that's actually been state policy since the 2004 plan. But it's never really been enacted, so to speak, because wolves haven't made it on their own from Wyoming in significant numbers to establish a population. So now, having said that, we don't expect wolves to establish in downtown Denver or out on the eastern plains where there's no natural prey base for them. So we expect them to essentially live where their primary prey, which is mostly elk, live. And that's the mountainous western half of Colorado. Prop 114 did specify reintroduction west of the Continental Divide. We totally expect wolves to spread out east of the divide and to all corners of the state and beyond eventually. But what's missing from the criteria right now is any geographic measurement of success. So those 200 wolves could be anywhere in the state. And if you look at Washington, Oregon, or the Mexican wolf program in Arizona and New Mexico, 200 wolves can actually fit in a smaller area than one might think. So Washington and Oregon each have about 200 wolves in just the eastern 1/3 of those two states. And if we had 200 wolves and they all lived in the northwestern corner of the state, we wouldn't really consider that successful. That would be a giant leap forward from where we are right now, but we wouldn't be done yet. And so what we would like to see is, in addition to what's in the plan now, some measurement of geographic connectivity across western Colorado. So, for example, a couple of us on the stakeholder group proposed that there could be wolf units drawn on a map, and that they could be based on existing elk units that the state already uses. And they would all be in the mountains. So we would not, we would ignore the eastern plains, for example, where we don't expect wolves to establish. But we would want all the core chunks of potential habitat that have significant prey base in Western Colorado to be occupied by at least some wolves before we delist them.
Okay, so the range is technically the whole state, but when considering success, there'll be certain areas that they won't hold as much weight as the optimal
Populated
areas, which I assume are the western slope.
Yeah, that's essentially right. I mean, historically, all of Colorado was wolf habitat and elk habitat. But until there's meaningful restoration of the prey species out on the eastern plains, which probably won't be in our lifetime, it doesn't make sense to actively pursue wolf restoration there.
Okay, and you both mentioned, Courtney, you both mentioned, but I'll ask Courtney this one. You both mentioned about carrying capacity is essentially limited by human tolerance, but we don't know what that is really yet. But don't we? I mean, does the voting from the public not help us to sort of map that out, specifically by location?
For social tolerance?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, assuming that the way a person votes is reflective of tolerance, because it gets very complex, because some studies by CSU post-vote indicated that, before the vote, up to 80% of the public said that they were going to vote for Proposition 114. After the vote, it was clear that didn't happen. It was a very slim margin. So there's a lot of factors that go into a person's response when they check a survey or asked a question, right? So I would argue, as a social scientist, that you can gauge a social tolerance through a variety of different ways, and there are folks in Colorado that are doing that. But at the end of the day, the public is going to either tolerate or not tolerate predators, right? We know this with bears and other predators and some of the mountain towns that are having to devise really unique programs to try to coexist. And all of that work, that hard work, is before us, which is why it's so important, from my perspective, to build the bridges now, preemptively and proactively, with outreach to producers, outreach to the hunting community. And of course, CPW has to do that. They're charged with doing that. But I implore all of us to do that. It's all of our jobs to do that for the wolves. It does not benefit the wolves to, as I said, stay in our corner, view through your binoculars the enemy on the other side of the line, and continue to polarize the debate, because the wolves are coming, and we need to find ways to work together to coexist.
What you're saying makes total sense, that the vote itself maybe not be enough, because there's a lot of nuances in voting, but also tolerance could very easily change once wolves are in the backyards of these folks. I mean, it could go either way, right? People who voted for it could become intolerant, and people who were intolerant could decide, oh, this actually isn't so bad. We can totally coexist. And tolerance can change. That's
right. And I mean, even nature enthusiasts have questions about wolves and interaction with dogs and hiking. And, we're getting a lot of getting a lot of questions, and a lot of misinformation is being put out there, and a lack of information is being put out there about wolves. And, that's part of what we're doing, that outreach.
I want to touch on this last thing, because I think it does tie into this social tolerance thing. And I know there is, and I know this hasn't really been discussed. I know it's sort of in there as like a phase 4, and this is, well past, hopefully, what Matt was talking about with the sustainable recovery population, is public hunting. And we see public hunting of wolves specifically. And we've seen this, obviously, how this has taken hold in Wyoming and in Montana and Idaho and all these other things, is the hunting of wolves. Because right now, the state law defines them as a non-game species. Is this something that is not being talked about in the near term, and is something that, is it going to be in the plan eventually? And is this sort of a game changer for certain groups of maybe outfitters and hunters that ultimately maybe, and again, I'm not proposing this, I'm just saying that, 5-10 years down the line, when the population is X, they have an opportunity to hunt them for, like you see in Montana. I don't know where this stands. I don't know where this sits. How does this ring for, I'll start with Courtney and then I'll go to Matt. Courtney, how does this, is this something that's been discussed, or is it sort of an outlier at the?
So you asked if it's a game changer for some groups. It's a non-starter from my perspective and our perspective. It's
Right.
also a betrayal of the people, the majority of Coloradans who voted for Prop 114 and the intent of the proposition itself. So we also believe it's illegal and against the current law as written and intended. So, wolves do not recognize state lines, as we know, and we must do everything to prevent the war being waged on wolves that's being waged outside of Colorado's borders from creeping in. We know, and when I say no, there's scientific studies that support the notion that when you liberalize killing, you're increasing, poaching and illegal killing. And so that is the floodgate that becomes opened when you try to accommodate a special interest, which is what this is. Phase 4, while discussed in the SAG, was not endorsed, nor was there consensus. So it does not have a place in the draft management plan or the final plan. And nevertheless, CPW contemplates a state delisting and recreational hunting without any scientific justification. And, we must keep recreational hunting of wolves off the table. And the electors of Colorado clearly closed that door on any public hunting of wolves by specifically designating them as non-game. So that's where I stand, and that's where we sit. And we do not believe it belongs in this management plan at all.
That's right. This is one of the areas where Colorado, we set out to make Colorado not be a repeat of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that's why Proposition 114 defined wolves as non-game. And so in the stakeholder group, Colorado Parks and Wildlife asked us to have a discussion about the potential of eventually having a phase 4 where there's enough wolves to hunt them. And I think that to some extent that reflects a professional worldview centered around hunting in the wildlife profession, and I include myself in that to some degree. In those other states, I think it was probably inevitable that the only way they could conceive of having a reintroduction was so that they could eventually hunt those animals. Of course, that's only half the story. The other half is it was a federal action that was resisted by the states all along, and so hunting those wolves is now enshrined in popular culture in those states too. But Colorado's different. Colorado has much more mutualistic values towards wildlife. We've known that for a long time. Surveys have shown that Coloradans have wanted the restoration of the full suite of native carnivores for many years now. And although we had to go to a ballot initiative to actually make it happen with wolves, but it was intentionally written into Prop 114 that they would be a non-game species. And so to change that, normally the Parks and Wildlife Commission can change the status of any species, whether it's non-game, game, fur bearer, or something else. But now it's written into state law that wolves are non-game. So that makes it different. And anyway, the stakeholder advisory group, we kicked it around, and it was clear that all the pro-wolf members of that group did not ever want to see hunting in Colorado. But the ranchers and the hunters and outfitters have, tend to have a much more utilitarian view versus a mutualistic one, and are more inclined to see animals as a resource to be harvested, that sort of thing. They all felt strongly that eventual hunting should be on the table in some way, even though currently it would be illegal. But we felt like, there's hardly any wolves in the state right now. There's, single digit number of wolves in one small part of the state. We don't know what the future is going to look like in a decade or 2 or 3. We don't know how many wolves are ever going to actually inhabit the state. We don't even really know whether future generations are going to want to hunt them or not. And right now, just even having this discussion about hunting contributes to the polarization. There is no need to even talk about it right now. There's no upside, there's only downsides. And so we agreed in the stakeholder group, we got everyone to agree to not make any decision about it now. And actually, most of us wanted to not even discuss it now. We would like CPW to just delete that section from the plan altogether. It's inevitably going to get talked about again in the future when there's a significant number of wolves. But it's better to be talked about later rather than right now. And there's a record that we talked about it in both the technical group and the stakeholder group, because those final reports are attached to the plan as appendices. So, that record's never going to get lost. It doesn't need to be maintained in chapter 4, I believe it is right now. So I really think the best thing that CPW could do right now is just delete all mention of it from chapter 4, and knowing that inevitably the state's going to discuss it at some point when there's a significant number of wolves.
And trust me, it's something I do not like to bring up. I just want to make sure that we cover all the bases. So I appreciate you both making sure that we just, talk about it just for a minute and not to give it too much light there.
Well, it's interesting, John, that, as Proposition 114 and 107 was contemplated and all the signatures were being gathered, over 215,000 signatures, and the process was moving along, there were some key conservation and, of course, animal welfare organizations that opposed Proposition 114 for the very fact that they believed it could be sabotaged or eventually exploited to basically grow wolves to kill them, to shoot them, right? And so, the intent of those individuals that instigated Proposition 114 is very clear. And of course, the voters of Colorado is very clear. And all of the public comments and sentiment that was expressed during the CPW and commission meetings was against public hunting and recreational hunting of wolves. So I, for one, strategically think it was valuable to have that opposition be seen now, because pushing it down the road for me means that it's going to come up again. It's probably maybe going to be shoved under the rug and somehow codified without adequate attention from the public. So I, for one, believed we needed to address the public hunting that was gaining some credibility and gaining some momentum. So I just wanted to add that.
No, that's great. Thank you, Courtney, for adding that. When we wrap up here really quick, I just want to get both of your takes. Now that the draft is out there, people can look at it. And those of you that are listening, we will have the link to the draft plan so you can all take a look at it. I know, as Courtney said, it's almost 300 pages, but really take the time to look through this draft plan so you can see what the deal is. I want to go to both of you really quick before I ask my last question, but I'll start with Courtney. What's something that people should, if they're going to be making public comment, and Matt, it's the same question for you. What's something that you personally think that they should look for, and how should they really be going at making their public comment and really forming something for discussion on their end as they approach this moving forward?
It's tough, because if you ask me as the advocate, I will say focus on those areas where you feel betrayed, or where you feel the Proposition 114 is betrayed or not adequately addressed. And it doesn't matter what that is. The organizational side of me and the strategic side of me says focus on those areas where you have the most chance of success, knowing that this plan may or may not be a negotiating tool for CPW. And so to focus on areas where science might help us in advocating for, let's say, higher recovery criteria, higher numbers for delisting or recovery criteria, and being realistic about it. So, I also know that the plan has some major gaps. So for me, I'm focusing on animal welfare. We'd like to include something about animal welfare in the section where they talk about capture and assessment of wolves for suitability for translocation. The plan completely dismisses the welfare and value of individual wolves if injured, and treats them as expendable by mandating that all wolves that are injured during the process should be humanely euthanized. And actually, I was very much encouraged by one of the commissioners, Dallas May, who is a rancher, by the way, who recommended that any of the wolves injured during this process will be considered for possible rehabilitation and permanent retirement or recovery in a wolf sanctuary. for long-term care. So capturing 12 to 15 wolves annually by trapping, darting, netting, there's going to be injuries. And considering the methods used to capture wolves for relocation, and considering the quick turnaround for a hard release into Colorado rather than a soft release, that's a gap, right? That's a gap. And if restoration is dependent upon every individual wolf that makes it into Colorado, whether flown, driven, or however captured for the Northern Rocky Mountains, that's a gap for me. So I know it's a long answer, but I'm not sure I adequately answered it, because it depends on who you are, and I say go for where your intuition tells you that this plan needs to be strengthened.
No, it's great, Matt. What do you think if you were to give advice there?
My answer is going to overlap quite a bit with that. I would focus on those areas that you either view as inconsistent with the intent of Prop 114 or inconsistent with the best available science, which Prop 114, by the way, does require the use of the best available science, or those things that don't quite align with the stakeholder advisory group or technical working group recommendations. So most of the plan does align with those recommendations, but there are a few cases where it's slightly different. And for example, I would argue up and down that lethal control should not be the first line of defense, that non-lethal tools should be explored and encouraged before the use of lethal. That's something that the entire SAG had consensus on, and that should be really explicit in Chapter 5, where the plan talks about impact-based management. And then that should be built out in Chapter 6 in the conflict minimization or prevention plan. That right there is the core of coexistence. And right now it's only about a page long. That should be an entire chapter right there. And so I would look for things like that may not be obvious because there's something that's just missing, or something that is maybe not quite what the stakeholders agreed to, or most importantly, if something is either unscientific or at odds with the intent of Prop 114.
Well, and I would add, it's focus on phase 4 and recreational hunting, and making sure that that's eliminated from the plan. If there's any one thing that folks that don't want to dig into the SAG recommendations or dig into the minutia of the plan, they should focus on that.
Since I've already asked Matt this question, since he's been on the podcast, Courtney, I'll ask you the last question I ask all of our guests is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Wild, family, potential, possibility, hope. That's not one word, is it?
That's what we meant anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. We meant whatever comes up.
Exactly. Whatever comes up. Y'all, we did it almost 90 minutes. So thank you, Matt.
That was a good one.
Matt Barnes and Courtney Vail for making the time, for really spending your Friday with us and making sure that the information gets out there where people should look for this. Again, those of you that are listening, go to the description. All of the links that Matt has sent me, Courtney has sent us, and the plan, where to find the public hearings, all that will be in the description. It's going to be a long one, but it's vitally important. So Matt Barnes, Courtney Vail, thank you both so much for hanging with Stephen and I. And
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, John, Stephen, and thanks for the work you do at Wolf Connection.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
House to y'all out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.